All right, welcome everyone. My name is, as Maggie mentioned, Rob Faux, and the last name is spelled F-A-U-X. If you know French, you know that it could be pronounced as faux, which means fake, which means you now understand why we named our farm the Genuine Fox Farm or the Genuine Faux Farm. We just have to use our name somehow and have a little bit of fun with it. Let's go on to the next slide and just move from there. So what I'm going to start with is our farm story, just to kind of let you know why this topic is important to us. We are a 15-acre small-scale diversified farm in Northeast Iowa, and we've been farming here since 2004. We have been involved with PFI for some time now, and we've also certified our vegetable production as certified organic. We have currently local markets that include restaurants, a retirement village, and a very small amount of direct consumer. But in the past, we have been in farmers markets. At one point in time, we had a 120-member CSA or farm share program. That kind of gives you an idea of what our farm is like and what it has been like in the past. We raise a diverse set of vegetables. We also raise poultry, which includes turkeys and chickens for meat and hens for laying eggs. The other thing that is perhaps new to some of you is the fact that I am communications manager in Iowa for the Pesticide Action Network. That started in 2020, and in fact, it started right about the time when the pandemic hit. So I have been doing that job in addition to farming now for about 2 years. Now, I'm not going to read the slide to you, but just to give you all a little bit of an idea of what our farm stands on, the principles that when we started our farm, we wanted to focus on. We wanted to be able to promote diversity on our farm. We wanted to be resilient. We wanted to have reasonable returns, pretty much all the things that you see there. And we were also interested in doing a little bit of research and connecting people to the land by doing educational things. What you see on the left is a picture of a couple of beds of carrots, and then flanking those are 2 fenced rows of snow peas. And then, of course, on the outside, we have other crops like cucumbers. So that's just an example of diversity within one of our growing plots that we would have most years on our farm. Just a little bit of idea of what we do and what it looks like here. And here's an overall view of the farm. You can notice that we're just a nice, perfect rectangle. We've got a couple of high tunnels in the picture that are both mobile buildings. In fact, they will move to a separate position every year so that we grow in a different spot each year under cover. We have various pastures. There are some fruit trees, a couple of buildings that are a little bit older that aren't in use. But that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. And our farm is surrounded by crops that are corn and soybeans. So you can kind of see all around the edges to the north, east, and south. To the south is a road, and then across from there are more corn and soybean fields. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at here. We're in the middle of corn and soybean country. The land is flat, and it's a fairly heavy loam soil. So here's the story that probably got me all started on this. I was aware of drift and concerned about drift before this, of course. But the event on our farm that really got us aware of the situation occurred in July of 2012. And it was in the evening, and I was outside doing work, which is pretty normal when it's a nice day and the sun's shining. And a spray plane came over the farm. And as it came over the farm, I noticed droplets falling on me and everything around me at that moment. So the first pass of this plane, basically, they turned the nozzle on while they were over me on the farm. And at that point in time, we were often taking digital cameras around with us so that we could record things. That was part of our promotional approach with the farm. We take pictures of things and try and promote them for sale. And so I had the digital camera, and I'm already wet with whatever the plane is flying. So I took pictures as this plane flew over the pasture where our turkeys and hens were. And the plane proceeded to go over our building and hit some of the other areas on our farm. And again, this was a Friday evening. So of course, part of the issue with that is it was kind of hard to find anybody to help us out because everybody was closed or away from the office at that time. And here's the picture of our farm again. And you'll notice that nice bright red line down, diagonal line down the center. That is essentially the area of our farm to the left on the west side. That's what was affected by the spray from this particular aerial applicator. They were spraying a combination of insecticides and fungicides for the soybean fields that were to our west and northwest. And the spray zone then took out some pastured poultry areas. We had our high tunnel at the time on that part of the farm. Various buildings, of course, were sprayed. Our southwest production fields were sprayed. The good news for us was the bulk of our vegetable production area and fruit trees were on the east side. That does not necessarily mean that this was a good thing, but it does mean that I still had some crops that were not directly impacted by the spray. The thing that it does mean that does make it more difficult is the fact that we were a certified organic operation. And what this means is now that the west side of my farm has been sprayed, everything on the west side can no longer be certified organic for a few years, and everything on the east side could be. So suddenly I became a split operation. Anytime I wanted to do something on the east side of my farm, I could do that, but I had to make sure that all my equipment, any containers, were all cleaned before I would take them to the other side of the farm. And you'll notice the buildings that say 04, 03, 02, 01, that's where I had everything stored, all my equipment, all my packaging materials. So you can guess how much fun it was to work a split operation for a few years after the spray event. Here are some of the things we had to deal with immediately after. We had beehives in the spray zone, and of course, both of those hives did not survive. We had various containers and things that are out on the line that were either harvest containers or towels we used for our operation. That means we had to clean all of that equipment before we could use it again. The high tunnel, of course, this was our second full season with that building. So the high tunnel was in the spray zone, and then all of our production in the southwest plots and the pastured poultry were all in the spray zone. And so what that means is that we were forced, due to this application, to get rid of a fair amount of production. What you're seeing in this slide is examples of some of the crop that we harvested after the spray event to keep a recording of what we would have produced, but none of this could be given to anybody to consume. So all the peppers you see in the picture, all the eggplant, all the eggs that you see there were all destroyed. None of this went to consumers. And I'm finding, even as I talk about this, even though this is 10 years ago, it's still kind of difficult to talk about. So this is something that I wanted to point out to everybody. This is why pesticide drift concerns us and why it should concern you. It's not just the fact that here I am trying to grow things and it was upsetting that I lost some crops or that I was outside when the drift came. What's upsetting to me is that we have all these concerns when people do not apply chemicals safely and it trespasses onto somebody else's farm. The first of which is food safety. Most of the chemicals sprayed on row crop fields are not rated for human consumption. And that means that if you even believe that it's possible that your crop has been contaminated, you have to dispose of it because you cannot give that to somebody and let them eat it for food safety reasons. Let's put it this way, you are responsible for their health. And if they should get sick, then you will carry the burden of whatever should happen after that point in time. Should they sue or the insurance company come after you, you hold that burden. The other thing is worker safety. We often hired college students or high school students. These are your kids, and so it is our responsibility as their employer to keep them safe. So if we should see a situation where there could be a drift situation or misapplication situation, we pull workers from the field. The problem with that, of course, is the fact that often a good time to spray is also a good time for us to have people in the field. But if we have to pull them because somebody is not following proper protocols for spray, that essentially means we've lost their work for that period of time. Sensitive crops, especially if we're talking about herbicides, we can have stunted or terminated growth if these chemicals should drift, which of course reduces our yield. Pollinators and beneficials. If with a lot of our crops, we're worried about having a good pollinator population. We're worried about having beneficials in there to help us control pests. And if pesticides should creep onto our farm, then suddenly we don't have their services. And that can reduce our yields and our bottom line suffers. With the animals on the farm, obviously, if they're outside or if they're in an area that gets sprayed, then we have to worry about their health. And this goes back to food safety. The question is, if you're going to harvest animals for meat, how quickly can they metabolize whatever it is they've had for intake from the pesticide? And also, if they're producing eggs, how much of that might be in that product? It's essentially a concern for animal health and food safety. And then maybe the biggest thing that we often don't talk about and should talk about more is the uncompensated losses that a farm like ours are going to suffer if drift should occur. There typically is not going to be financial relief immediately should you have losses because of drift. And so that means a farm that has had a drift incident, especially if it is a food production farm, typically has to reside or rely on its own backup. There isn't a way for us to get compensation quickly to make up for whatever losses we're immediately having. And then finally, the other thing that I think people don't talk about much is the increased workload that comes about simply because of the event on your farm. Things like split production or moving your animals off of a pasture that's been hit with a pesticide. And the cleanup time certainly was not minimum. So that's kind of an idea of what happened to us and why I'm pretty involved in this. And sadly, 2012 was not the only year our farm had to deal with some pesticide drift. What you're seeing on the screen now are some cucumbers and evidence of a particle herbicide drift. And particle herbicide drift typically happens when you have a strong wind coming in your direction. And usually you'll notice it because you will have been out there probably the day before or a day before that and found everything to be in very good shape. And then right after an application, you can go out and find all these nice little yellow dots, sometimes brown, depending on how things had been had carried there and how much there was on pretty much any broadleaf in this case. What the folks were spraying, they were spraying for broadleaf weeds. And so, of course, all of our broadleaf plants, including cucumbers, peas, you name it, they were all pretty much dotted like this the next day after the drift. So this is an example of particle herbicide drift. And I see Carl DePoltz is putting a introduction to pesticide drift link from the EPA on there, which probably includes things about particle pesticide drift and also might mention vapor pesticide drift, which is the next slide here. We can get vapor pesticide drift, especially in situations where we have a temperature inversion. And for those who don't quite understand what a temperature inversion is, it's typically going to occur in the evening and when we've been applying pesticides on warmer days. And if you look at the image on the right-hand side, you can kind of see that sometimes you will have a warm layer of air a little bit above the ground level. And you can probably think back to days when maybe you've noticed smoke from a bonfire doesn't go too far up into the air before it starts traveling from side to side. And there are some products such as 2,4-D or some of the dicamba products that are very prone to volatilization and drift and can travel quite a ways. Part of the difficulty with vapor pesticide drift, is the fact that you don't necessarily see it just on field edges. It doesn't necessarily come to light in a non-target field right on the edge. It could travel into the center of a farm or into the center of a field, and you'll find patches of it, which is not necessarily, it becomes very difficult for a person to try and figure out exactly where this came from. Vapor volatilization and vapor drift often happens more if we're doing over-the-top spray. So if a lot of your herbicide spray is going on to some leaf matter, that's more likely to volatilize and drift. So there's another thing that would be interesting to note. This is a picture of me, and I think it's 2015. I'm putting together what's known as a drift catcher. And the drift catcher was used to try and detect certain insecticides that were being used, typically in July and August in our area. And basically, we had this thing running 24/7 during the spray season. And we were attempting to find out if there were chemicals in the air in the center of our farm. And so we put this thing in the center of the farm, we had it running, and of course sent all of the test tubes of sample with the resin in them to an appropriate place to test them. And we found that during a certain particular point in time, we had chlorpyrifos in levels that would have been dangerous for small children on our farm in the center of the farm. And we discovered it on a day that was after an application that was 1 mile away from our farm and a very light wind coming in our direction. And the reason I mention that is just to once more point out, different chemicals have different propensities for drifting. Chlorpyrifos is one of those. It has a long history of drifting in fairly calm conditions and can travel a decent distance. And this was just simply some further evidence that that was the case. Something that's fairly new since 2017, and in fact occurred after the last time I did a Farminar for PFI on drift, is dicamba products and the use of dicamba products as an over-the-top spray on soybeans. And the difficulty with that is it gets sprayed once again so that it will land on leaf surfaces. It often gets sprayed in June when temperatures are often going to be above 85 or even above 80. And we have more likelihood of various temperature inversion situations. And it has been found that dicamba can volatilize and drift for up to 3 days after application. Some have suggested longer, but I've pretty much only seen stronger evidence for up to 3 days. And the hard part is the symptoms can appear 7 to 21 days, 1 to 3 weeks after the actual exposure, and it won't necessarily be on field edges. And initial symptoms are leaf cupping, twisting around the growth points, maybe leaf and flower drop. And there's all kinds of information that you can easily see for soybean cupping and damage if you're growing a non-dicamba ready soybean. That's well documented, and you can find all kinds of information on that. There's a little bit less documentation for vegetable crops, but there is becoming more and more of it. And here's an example of a couple pepper plants that exhibited dicamba drift damage. Remember, dicamba is a growth inhibitor, and so it's going to be attacking especially the growth points. You're going to see some of that curling. This is later in the process, so you're seeing more damage to the bigger leaves, and it's been dropping them. And pretty much what will happen is your plants won't necessarily die. They'll hang on. And they'll hang on and do next to nothing as far as production is concerned. Jorgen's asking about the drift detectors, whether they're widely available and something I'd recommend for folks to use on their farms. That's a great question. The drift catchers were developed by Pesticide Action Network, and they were probably most used in two locations: in California near schools, and in Minnesota near some of the potato production fields in that state. And in both cases, there were larger communities of people near the fields, obviously kids in the schools, and there was a lot of motivation to try and make sure that there wasn't pesticides going to those locations. Unfortunately, in Iowa, it was difficult to do this, in part because we're often running these things. They require electricity, and trying to get the electricity to them in the places that you might want to be using them is difficult. And the other difficulty is the fact that if you want to try and catch drift, it is not a simple matter of running it all the time. You actually have to visit the detector 2 times a day at minimum, and you're collecting a tube for every 12 hours, I believe it is. I'm trying to remember this from several years ago. So in answer to your question, they are not widely available, and probably not something I'd recommend for people to use on their farms, because it's just difficult to get a hold of them. And on top of that, you have to be able to send all of these test tubes with the resin for testing. And that's where most of the expense is trying to send it to a lab and testing for the pesticide. The biggest problem with it is the simple fact that each test has to test for a different pesticide. So you can see how quickly that would become cost prohibitive. Right now, I'm hoping to try and locate other ways that maybe farms, people who are interested, could perhaps look for ways to detect that maybe drift is happening on their farm. But unfortunately, this is not it. Some resources here. I talked about identification for dicamba drift and other kinds of drift, like the spotting on leaves. There are 3 links here, and the nice thing is Maggie will grab the links that are in this production and send them out to you, so you don't have to worry about it too much. I know these are long, and there's a lot of percent sign things in here. And these are just 3 resources that are on the web to help you learn how to identify injury by pesticides on vegetables. The first one that you see there for dicamba and 2,4-D injury on vegetables is something that I'm actually pretty impressed with. There are many places that attempt to show it, and the pictures are often very, very hard to see what you're looking at. It's not a simple matter to take pictures and make it easy for somebody to identify what's going on, and they actually do that in this first resource. And then, of course, there's a good one for berry crops, and that includes some glyphosate damage, among others. So just 3 examples, and I am sure there could be a long list of others. So that was herbicide drift, and that's not the only thing we have to worry about. We've got insecticide and fungicide drift, and you're typically not necessarily going to have the same kind of physical evidence. I mean, if you have herbicide drift, you typically get a notification by looking at your plants and seeing weird things happening to them. With insecticide and fungicide, it's not often so dramatic. You might notice if you come home and you start sniffing and you're like, I smell something, maybe that's an indication that somebody sprayed nearby while you were away and it drifted. You might see some residue on various surfaces like high tunnel plastic, maybe a windshield of a car. But again, that's kind of a hard way to figure out that it's happened. So it's hard to detect unless you're just watching and you have somebody at your farm making sure that they're watching for these things. I want to point out that usually when insecticide and fungicide are getting applied on corn and soybeans, a vegetable farm or a food production farm like mine has a number of crops that are probably producing. That these are key yield points for us. And so we need to keep that in mind. And then most field crop pesticides, this is the real capper, are not rated for human consumption without a setback of some kind. And what a setback means is how long you have to wait before you eat something that has been exposed to the pesticide. So let's put 2 and 2 together. If my crop is yielding now and I want to harvest it today to give to people to eat tomorrow, and the setback is 30 days, that means that everything is ripe now is no good for consumption. And we need to just keep that straight. We need to keep that in our heads. Okay, we're going to get into the weeds. And we'll talk about the setback. That's a good question. So let's start with setback itself. The idea of a setback is how long do you have to wait after you've applied the chemical to a crop? So if you look down at the bottom right, you'll see a pre-harvest interval or a setback. Do not apply within 21 days of harvest. So essentially what that would mean is if somebody sprayed chlorpyrifos, that's one of the products that was sprayed in 2012 that landed on our farm, then for this particular crop, you would have to wait 21 days. So let's say I have a crop of green beans that are ripe right now, and the spray plane flies over, it drifts onto my green beans. I would have to wait 21 days to use any of that crop for anyone to be able to eat it. So if you know green beans, you know that you have to keep picking it, and that by the time we've gone through 3 weeks, probably you're past the peak for your green bean crop. So that means that pretty much none of the production from that iteration of green beans is going to be safe for consumption. Okay, so essentially the setback has to be the period from once it contacted the plant. The other thing that I want to point out is the REI, the restricted entry interval. Most pesticides have an REI rating. And what that means is this is the period that you as a human being should stay out of the spray zone. And I want to make this one very clear because I have talked to numerous people who have had to deal with spray incidents, and they frequently are not told what the REI is, and they're frequently not told that they should vacate the premises if they are in a small farmstead like ours and drift were to come to our farm. Then to stay safe, to stay healthy, we should leave the farm because our farm has become a spray zone. And we should be off that farm in the example that you see for the worker restricted entry interval at the left. That would have been a 24-hour period. Some of the products that were sprayed on us in 2012 had a 48-hour period. So we should have been advised at the point that this occurred that we needed to leave our farm for 2 days to get out of the spray zone, or we should have pitched a tent on the east side of our farm so we could have been out of the spray zone. So that's one of the things that disturbs me. We often don't talk about is the REI. There's a period of time you should not be in the field. When pesticide companies created this, I think they were thinking more along the lines of if somebody sprays a field and workers need to go out and work in the field, you need to keep them out of that field for a day or two after application. I don't think they're necessarily thinking about a drift incident, but it should still apply. So those are two things on use labels that are very important to all of us. How long does it have to be before you can actually use a harvest so it can be consumed? And how long do you need to stay out of the spray zone? Here are a couple more examples of some of the products, the labels that I looked at the time in 2012 when we were sprayed. Use labels include required weather conditions and details about application methods. So these use labels will often say things like you shouldn't apply it with winds over 10 miles an hour or 15 miles an hour. They may make suggestions about maximum temperatures, or they may actually have a requirement about a maximum temperature. For example, currently dicamba cannot be applied in Iowa with temperatures over 85 degrees. So essentially the guidelines for the use of an insecticide, any kind of pesticide, insecticide, fungicide, herbicide are included in the use labels. And people are required, applicators are required to follow these use labels by federal law. The other thing that's in these labels would be health and safety related information. What happens if you are exposed to it? If you get it in your eyes, what do you need to do? If you happen to consume some of it by accident, what do you do? That information is also included on use labels. And this is how you find use labels. The EPA actually has a search system. The link is above. And it looks, the front page for this looks like what you see on your screen. And you can go here and you can actually take a look at the use labels for any product that might have been sprayed. And if you want to find those labels, this is what their search page looks like. So down towards the bottom, you can enter a product name or a brand name, or you could enter the chemical name or something along the lines of chlorpyrifos, for example, or 2,4-D, and it would help you hunt for the particular product and label. And typically what happens is it will come up with a list. If you said chlorpyrifos, it I believe contains a list of about 20 different products, and you could take a look at each one of those labels. It also sometimes includes generations of labels, so you can actually look up and see how a label's use requirements have changed over the years. But you can find all that information here on the EPA site. So let's get a little bit out of those weeds and let's just talk a little bit about what happens if you've dealt with drift. What you're seeing at the bottom left are some of the peas that were in the same field as the cucumbers. For those who are interested, we like to grow peas and cucumbers in the same plot. They're good companions for each other. And once again, you see the spotting on the leaves that wasn't there the day prior to the spray event. And once again, it's a broadleaf and it's showing spotting. And these peas at that point were actually producing, so we could not use the fruits on these particular plants. So you've been drifted on, now what? So this is what we often do on our farm. If we see somebody setting up for spray or a spray is in progress, the first thing we do is we check the weather conditions. If you've got wind coming your way, that's of course the first alarm bell, but you just take a look at the weather conditions and consider what's the likelihood you're going to have a problem with drift. It doesn't hurt to flag down the sprayer, especially before they enter the field if you can, and just discuss with them what they're doing. Ask them what they're applying so you have record of that, because it's certainly difficult to find the information you need if you don't know what the products are that they're applying. Always talk with them civilly. But don't let people bully you out of the discussion. You have every right to know what they're spraying on their field, especially if you're worried that it could infringe on your growing or your health or your well-being. And typically I found that if you're polite and ask the questions, they'll discuss it with you. So try and flag down the sprayer, especially if you feel like conditions are going to be ripe for drift. Have a digital camera or whatever and take some pictures and videos. I actually typically take pictures almost every time somebody is spraying a nearby field, just to help me record the day and the time and what was going on, so I have a record of it for myself. I also tend to roll down high tunnel walls when application's going on, just to prevent the pesticide from actually getting into the high tunnel in the first place. This can be a problem during very warm days, of course. That can bake the plants, which can be just as bad as a pesticide. But if I can manage it, I roll down high tunnel walls. If I think there's a chance that things might drift, I pull workers from the fields. If it's possible, I might close up some animals and close up the house. Those are just all things we tend to do if we think there's a chance for drift on the farm and we notice it. If there is drift, then our immediate responses include lots of phone calls. You may call the farmer if you know who they are, that know the farmer and who owns the field or who operates on the field. You may call the co-op or the spraying company. You may find yourself calling an airport if it's an aerial flight and trying to figure out who the flyer is contracting with. We have even called the sheriff to try and help us identify who it was. In fact, that's what happened in 2012, is we called the sheriff and asked for help tracking down where that flyer came from. We call the Pesticide Bureau and report that there was a misapplication. Since we're organic certified, we had to call our certifier and notify them that this had happened. An insurance company, of course, and of course, if you've been sprayed on or you're not feeling well, you contact a doctor. If you happen to be sprayed, one of the things we ended up doing, since I did get dosed with pesticides. Take the time to bag up the clothing, put it in a bag, put that in a refrigerator or somewhere cool. And then I was instructed by the doctor to take a long, long shower. And when we asked how long, they said, well, at least 30 minutes, but probably an hour, which seems like overkill, but that's what they told me to do. Record the weather conditions and record all the actions you take carefully. Get a notebook, write it all down, write down times, write down observations, and write it down objectively, because your perception of the event is going to change almost within hours. So write it down as you observe it, so you can be accurate, and so that what your report will be later on is going to have integrity. Include times, dates, and locations. And so here we are. We're going to make a report to the IDALS Pesticide Bureau. And to report to IDALS, you have to either give them a call at the number that you see at the top of the screen or send them an email. There is not currently an online form or other method to make a report. So you have these two options: you email or you call. In the case of course, our situation, the spraying event happened after their office hours. So of course we left a message and we left an email. But that's essentially what you need to do. And you need to include some things like your name, how you can be contacted, the location of the spray event. And of course, you will be asked all these questions again as they do the intake on the case. But this is how you report in Iowa. I noticed that I think it's Galen is from Indiana. Galen, I think that if you wanted to do the same thing, you'll find that your Department of Agriculture probably has a similar department, a similar bureau, and it would be a relatively similar process. You'd give them a call and you'd make a report. Now, what you need to remember about the Pesticide Bureau is their purpose is to enforce the use label that has been created, and it must be followed by federal law. Their purpose is not to help you get compensation. Their purpose is not to provide you with a quick turnaround on the tests. Their purpose is to simply enforce federal law and establish whether or not somebody failed to follow the use label. We need to get this straight in our heads, because we might have expectations otherwise, especially if we're a food grower. When you make the report, you need to be prepared to give a factual account. I know it's tempting to get upset and do a lot of yelling because you're upset. But these folks are there to help you, so do your best. As far as sampling is concerned, you're going to need to select sampling sites so you can get leaf samples or plant samples to try and find out if, in fact, yes, you have spray on the plants. When you give people documentation at the Pesticide Bureau, maintain copies of everything, hold on to copies of it all. Do not expect a quick turnaround. Do not expect that you will learn the results of their tests anytime soon. Okay, it will take some time, because once again, what they're doing is they're looking to enforce the federal use label laws, but they are not built to respond quickly to a food grower who needs to know, is my food safe? So just keep that in mind as you make the report. But remember, you need to report, because by reporting, this identifies whether or not we're having a larger problem with drift. Whether we need to do more about certain things, whether we need to respond. If we don't have reports, then we don't have the knowledge in the government system to make change. So that brings me to the next thing, taking your own test samples. Clearly, if you can't wait on the government to provide you with a result quickly, and you want to know whether or not your food is safe to give to somebody, then you need to take your own test samples. And you need to select your sites carefully. By that, I mean, typically we're looking at a drift situation, and you will probably have a pretty good idea of about how far in you think the drift has come, unless it's dicamba, and then it's a little bit harder to figure. You want to try and give yourself enough test samples to try and identify how far the spray has encroached on your farm. It's easy if it's herbicide, because you see damage. It's less easy if it's fungicide or insecticide, because you don't necessarily see damage. So you're trying to select sites, say maybe, 30 feet in, 70 feet in, 100 feet in. It kind of depends on your farm, but you're trying to identify where things are safe and where they're not safe. You're going to need to use disposable gloves and a plastic bag for the sample. You need to label each bag with the location, date, time, and perhaps even identify the plant if you can do that. But you need to keep them all straight. You label them as soon as you get them put in the bag. Put them in a cool location like a refrigerator. Take the samples as soon as it's safe for you to go and take the samples. And you need to find out what you're testing for. You need to figure out what the chemicals are that were applied. If you can send these things to a lab and say, well, it was a pesticide, and they're not going to be able to necessarily test for everything unless you've got an awful lot of money. So you need to know what they're testing for. And on top of that, not every lab can test for every pesticide. So you may have to do a little shopping around. Private testing can be costly. And the turnaround is still, with private test sites, often 2 weeks. I've heard of some turning it around in 3 to 4 days. But once again, if you're talking about, I have yield now that I want to harvest and give to people, this still probably means you're going to end up disposing of some of your crop. The good news is PFI actually has a list of private labs. This is what was last updated on February 2017. The link is up above. Once again, contact the various labs, find out who is able to test for the pesticide you're looking for. Ask them how quickly they can turn it around. Especially if you're looking at a crop you're hoping to still be able to sell. Let them know. I need to know whether this is a go or a no-go, and they can usually help you out. Here's an example of test results. These are the test results we got in 2012. Each sample will get its own report for most of these companies. So if you've got 5 samples, then you'll probably have a report for each one. This is why you should label things clearly so you can know exactly which sample came from where. You should probably ask for the instructions for sampling and shipping. I know I said you should use disposable gloves and plastic bag, but each of these particular places might have specific instructions they want you to follow. So it's a good idea to call them first, identify who you're going to send the sample to, and then go about taking your samples. And the thing that we most appreciated when we did this is we asked for a consultation on the results. And they were particularly good at answering our questions. They were patient with us. They made it clear that they wouldn't necessarily testify in a court case for us, but they were able to clarify what we were seeing. And let me emphasize one more time, keep asking them questions until you are satisfied that you understand what these reports are telling you. Whatever you have to do, just keep asking the questions. You are not stupid. You just need to know. So ask. So once you get a test result, this is where it gets a little complicated. And this is where maybe having conversations with the testing agency can help you. What we did is we found out, well, this is how much is on our plants. And then we went out and looked at the Code of Federal Regulations to find out what the amount was allowed for those chemicals to be on food and still be considered safe according to federal law. Hunting this down is not necessarily a fun process, and it's very time consuming, at least it was for us at the time. But you go to the Part 180 materials on the Code of Federal Regulations. You'll see at the top left, that's the header of the page that you go to. If you look at the bottom left, you'll notice a sample of the list of chemicals that they have for tolerance levels. And I had to find the proper chemicals. And once I clicked on that, you get a page that's like the thing that's on the right. And it'll list everything that is a product that could have this chemical on it. And it lists the parts per million that are allowed on this product. All right, so For example, asparagus would be allowed to have up to 0.5 parts per million on it as a residue. This sounds complicated, but what this is this is just a way for you to determine whether or not your product is safe. So for example, our asparagus had a rating of about 3.6 parts per million, which means we well exceeded the safe levels, and that asparagus would have been no good if you had those numbers. But if it was 0.3, then you could say, okay, according to tolerance levels, I could sell this. I couldn't sell it as certified organic, but I could sell it, and it follows the regulations for the residue levels. Once again, if this doesn't make sense to you, let me encourage you that once you get your test results, you find somebody to help you navigate this and figure out whether your product is safe. We got in touch with the cooperative after the spray, and the cooperative who was in charge of the spray was hired by the grower or the farmer or landowner, and they hired an applicator. And the applicator is not necessarily an employee of the co-op, especially if it's a flyer. They often will hire a flying company to do that work. But the cooperative or whoever ordered the spray is somebody you want to go to so you can figure out what was applied. And you can see in the image down below, these are the things that were applied in 2012 to the field near our farm. It includes the carrier, which was water, and various other information, the date, the times, what they thought the wind speed was, all those kinds of pieces of information. And often they will have an aerial spray map available for you, especially if it was a flight, and a lot of spray rigs that are ground rigs now have GPS as well, and they can often provide you with this information. And it shows, in this case, this shows the aerial spray. And if you look down into the area where our farm is, you can see clearly that the GPS recorded that the sprayer nozzles were on when they were on our farm. So it's fairly clear that they were off of the target field. But ask for this, ask for the GPS spray map if you can get it. It should be available in many cases, and always, as far as I'm concerned, in aerial spray cases. So we're looking at another thing now. Our 2012 event was a spray plane, and we got pictures of the spray plane, and we were able to get the N number, which is the plane identification number. And if you look at the picture at the top right, you'll see an oval, and that oval shows you where that N number should be. Some of the things that I'm going to show you may not be important to you, but looking up the N number is important because that can help you figure out who's doing the spraying, and you can actually use that to figure out who contracted the spray. It's pretty hard to get much help if you don't know who's doing the spraying. And the N number is just another way you can find out who did this. So we got this right here. You can look at it. And we actually contacted the FAA. I'd like to say that it was worth the effort to do so. Unfortunately, I think Tammy will probably argue that this was probably not very time efficient. But if you want to, contact the Flight Standards District Office in your area. I think Des Moines would be pretty much all of Iowa. If you do work with the FAA, remember the burden of proof is on you, and you'll practically have to lead them by the nose to show them what you're looking at, that you were on a sensitive crops directory. But pretty much regulations provide all kinds of exemptions for aerial applicators, including height above buildings, among other things. So if you want to, you can pursue the FAA, but the biggest thing about them is you can get that N number, and it can help you identify who was doing the spraying. So what if you get sprayed? What if you yourself get sprayed? And I just had to put this little picture on here. That's Mo Farah being chased by a spray plane. If you yourself have been sprayed, you can go to this site, Pesticide Info, and you can go and take a look. You can type in the product name, you can type in the chemical name, and it'll take you to the page that you see on the bottom left. And you'll notice that there's a little button that says poisoning symptoms. That will take you to the thing that you see on the bottom right, which will include suggestions of things you need to look out for, whether you're having dizziness or blurred vision or various other issues, and then suggestions for what the best first aid response can be. So this site is a fairly new resource that you can go to if you want to see what kinds of symptoms, acute symptoms that might occur to you and what you need to do. So here are some samples of things that we harvested from our field after the spray, and these were all things we had to destroy. So the setback period was not met. What do we do now? Since we are not a commodity crop farm, and food crop farmers are typically not going to have it easy when it comes to trying to establish what you've lost, one of the things that we found ourselves doing is, rather than, since we had the fungicide insecticide issue, the plants still produced. But what we found ourselves doing is we selected areas to do sample harvest so we could establish that our crops were producing, that we were in fact losing production because of the spray. What this does is this essentially establishes that you actually have a loss. We took pictures, weights, and recorded it all. We let everything go through a normal crop cycle. And we also used prior records to confirm that this was pretty normal harvest numbers. We also made sure that we tracked our acquisition of replacement product. So if our customers wanted peppers, since peppers were in the field that got sprayed, we couldn't produce or provide any of our own. So we actually found another certified organic farm and purchased peppers from them so our customers could have peppers. And you need to keep track of that information because that's a loss that has something to do with the event. I've had some people question me why I say we condemn crops when we do. The main thing is it's a matter of liability, folks. We discussed with our insurance representative what to do. And their suggestion was, until you have test results that show your crops are safe, it's best to hold off. For example, we will hold off on the peas. We still picked the peas because peas are a crop that you want to keep picked if you want them to keep producing. So we harvested peas until we got the test results and threw them away and hoped that we got test results that were below levels that would say they were safe. Also, it was suggested to us that we could still decide, even if we had residue levels that were considered safe, we could still decide that we weren't comfortable with that and destroy them. It kind of depends on your consumer base and what they want from you. It was suggested to us by somebody we could create a hold harmless agreement that we could have our customers sign. And I was told very strongly by a lawyer that that might not hold up in a liability suit. If somebody decided later on, I got sick and you knew your crops had been sprayed and you gave it to me anyway, a hold harmless agreement record may not necessarily provide you with protection. So again, if you want to protect yourself from liability, it's probably better to just hold off sending this produce out to people. In the end, the net result is someone becomes ill with your product, you may be liable. It's not going to necessarily be whomever made the application that drifted. You get to carry the burden as far as that's concerned. Livestock and poultry, some things that we had to do as far as that was concerned. We looked at grazing setbacks. There are setbacks for yield. There are also setbacks for grazing. So if an area has been sprayed with some of these products, you have to keep your animals out of the grazing area for a certain period of time. Labels often list acute symptoms for poultry. or other animals. So you can look on the use label to see what you should be looking for your animals. Unfortunately, none of the labels gave us an idea of how long it would take for these animals to flush any toxins out of their symptoms. That's something that we had difficulty with. And I've been looking at that even more in the last year, and I still haven't found anything terribly helpful there. So you just have to assume that maybe it'll flush out eventually. And one of the ways to flush it out is if they're in a spray zone, you have to move them to a new pasture. You got to move them out of the pasture that's been sprayed into a new pasture that's not been sprayed so they can begin flushing the toxins out. And I think I said some of that already right there. Other things we needed to do: clean and disinfect all the waters and feeders. Need to monitor their animal health and keep records of that. In fact, for 2 weeks, we were keeping daily records of what we were observing with our poultry crops, just to see what was going on. And of course, the last thing you need to do is you need to show that you're doing things to mitigate further losses. In other words, if you want to make a claim with an insurance company or through litigation, you have to show that you're doing things to address the problem, to address the situation, to lessen the loss. And if you keep documentation of that, then of course you'll be able to handle the situation fairly well. Galen's asking, could the manure possibly contaminate the clean pasture? Galen, the answer to that question is yes, it could possibly contaminate the clean pasture. So you have to make some decisions. You could leave your animals on the contaminated pasture and run the risk that they will get toxic levels high enough to basically take that crop out. You could euthanize the animals and get nothing out of them. Basically, you're going to have to make a decision. Now, as far as how much contamination you could get through the manure, that's a good question. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure anybody has done research on that question. But you have to make the assumption, especially early on, that whatever they've taken in is still going to go through their system and will come out in the urine and the manure. So yes, that could be a problem. Will it be enough of a problem to deal with or cause a problem with organic certification, for example? I can't answer that. I think that would be something your certifier would have to answer. But I think that's probably about all I can say about it. It's something you got to consider. Maggie's asking what I do with all the sprayed and compromised produce. Another good question. Most of the produce that was sprayed and compromised went into compost piles that were in the spray zone already. So over time in that compost pile, they're going to break down eventually. And we waited until we could do some testing that things were clear before we could use that compost. We did not allow any of that produce that was compromised leave the western half of the farm, for example. So it stayed in the western half of the farm and it was composted. And otherwise, what else are you going to do with it? That was about it. We didn't eat any of it. We didn't give it to anybody else to eat. We didn't give it to the animals to eat. It simply became a compost. Here's a couple of things. We keep our customers informed using blogs. And it was both blogs and email that we let our customers know when we have spray problems and why they're not seeing particular products. If you are a food producer, you have to find your way to let your customers, whether they're a bulk sales or they're a food hub or whatever, you have to find ways to handle the situation. And we found that the best way to do it is to do two things: be completely upfront and let them know what's going on. You don't have to tell them too many details, but you have to tell them enough so they understand where you're coming from. And then what people like to hear is what you're doing to mitigate the effects that they're going to see. Our customers in particular liked the fact that we were seeking out another certified organic farm to get the vegetables that we weren't going to have in our CSA shares. They felt like we were taking care of them. Remember, some of your losses uh, could be future sales, not just the sales that you've lost because your yield is gone. It could be future sales. So keeping your customers informed, keeping them up to date with what you're doing to mitigate the effect that they might see, all of this basically builds up for you goodwill that keeps your customers with you. So this is important. There are two links there. Our farm blog is the top link. And for those of you who are interested, I actually do write for Pesticide Action Network fairly frequently. And that link would be showing you the Iowa news that I often write about once a month for PAN and other blogs that I write for PAN. So if you want to see what kinds of writing I do, there's your links, but keep your customers informed. So this is the part I couldn't do anything much on the PFI Farminar I did back in 2015, I think it was, or 2014, because we were still in litigation for that spray event in 2012. So I couldn't say much about compensation. If you need compensation, which I think you should, if you're losing yield, you're doing more work, you have health concerns because of these events, then there should be some sort of compensation. The first thing that we have done is we've asked for the liability insurance representative contact for the sprayer or for the farmer or whoever is responsible for the spray event, because you will probably work with the insurance representative, their adjuster, the most. You should be prepared, however, to seek legal representation, especially if you feel like you're being bullied or you feel like you're in over your head. You're not sure what people are saying to you. It wouldn't hurt to get some legal representation or counsel of some kind to help you get through this, because it's pretty easy to feel overwhelmed when you enter into this situation. Documentation is important. Get it written down, get it recorded. That will become your best friend as you go through the process. Unfortunately, unless your losses are commodity crops or row crops, the compensation process typically takes more time than you want it to. So you're going to have a period of time where you are going to be short cash because you won't be able to sell some of your food, you won't be able to sell some of your product that you were expecting to sell. So you're going to be short cash. So you're going to have to do something about that, because your process of getting compensation is going to be a little bit harder than if you were growing soybeans next to somebody else's soybean field and there was drift. Typically, that's pretty easily handled. At the point of sale, you determine the difference between, say, certified organic and non-organic, or you determine yield reduction numbers and you compensate based on that. But if you're talking about peppers, and you're talking about peppers direct to consumer, you can't get compensated. It doesn't help to get compensated for bulk rates that you might get in Chicago versus what you actually get at a farmer's market or direct to a particular restaurant. Those numbers aren't the same. So you have to spend a lot of time trying to establish the value of your crop. That's something that took us a lot of time. If you decide to go to litigation, it's time consuming. The discovery process, what they call the discovery process, is often intrusive. It takes a lot of time. They'll ask you lots of questions and you'll have to provide all kinds of information, some of which you don't believe they should have to know, but that's still all part of the process. You have to be prepared that that's how it's going to be. And it may be the only way you can get compensation. And that's kind of how it landed in our 2012 event. The other thing that litigation does is we've noticed, serve as a bit of a deterrent. People for several years after, and this does not necessarily just include the co-op we were dealing with, they were calling us more quickly that when they were going to do spraying in our area. They were much more cognizant that we were there. So from that perspective, it helped. If you do want to seek litigation, interview multiple lawyers. Not every one of them is going to do well for you. Find one that listens and explains well. They are your expert advisor. Okay, they should not be telling you exactly what you should do. You shouldn't feel like you're being pushed into something. Instead, you should feel like they're a trusted advisor that have expertise in the legal system that can help you find your way through. And we were lucky to find such a lawyer and go through the process. And even then, it was a difficult process. And for those who are curious, it took us 2.5 years before we did see compensation for the 2012 event. And the last thing I wanted to point on that is once something's broken, once somebody's dropped the China bowl is broken. The crops are lost. You have to deal with a split operation if you're doing organics. It's broken. So, of course, what we're hoping to do is we are hoping to do things to prevent drift. So what are some things we can do? More signs, more buffer zones, sending letters to all the co-ops, lots of communication, flag down those ground applicators and remind them what you're doing on the farm and why you're concerned. Register your sensitive crops, register your bees, record things. One of the things we stopped doing is we stopped leaving the farm during spray season, or if we had to leave the farm to do a vegetable delivery, we'd ask somebody to come stay at the farm to keep an eye on things, to make sure something didn't happen while we were gone. Just a lot of things we can do, and I'll talk about that more in a later slide, but I wanted to get to this one. There's a really nice tool called Field Watch. And anybody who's growing a sensitive crop, an alternate crop, has an apiary or bees, or maybe even sensitive animal crops, you can register with Field Watch. You can use Drift Watch for the specialty producers and Bee Check for the beekeepers. I strongly encourage you to register. I strongly encourage those who actually apply pesticides to check to see if there's anybody in the area that you are applying to, see that they're there. I am surprised frequently that when I do approach sprayers, they don't always know to look at Field Watch. So of course, when I talk to them, I'm often referring them to Field Watch and say, hey, just to prevent having somebody come running out of their house, their farmhouse, yelling at you with all kinds of 4-letter words, maybe you could check Field Watch first, know that it's possible, and then be prepared to talk to them in a civil fashion to try and calm their fears that you're going to follow all of the use label laws and be careful with your application. So it's a great tool. I strongly recommend you put yourself on there. If you can't figure out what your coordinates are for Field Watch, here's a tool to help you find the GPS coordinates. And the other thing that happens is if you put your site on Bee Watch, if you happen to have an apiary on your farm, the other thing that this does is this actually limits the time of day that insecticides can be applied within a certain range of your farm. So this is just another thing to keep in mind, is they're trying to protect the bees who will be out of the hive during the warmth of the day. So that's just one more thing to keep in mind if you have bees. So I'm pretty much reaching the end of the presentation here. So I'm prepared to answer questions if people have them. But I went back to the picture of our farm because I can talk about some of the mitigation techniques we're using. For example, if you look in the north, you'll notice we've got a bush line, and we're trying to establish bush lines in the east, and we have bush lines in other locations. So we have buffer zones because we're certified organic. They require at least 30 feet buffer zone. But we're also trying to do vertical buffers. So we're trying to grow taller things that will hopefully absorb some of the potential drift that might come off the fields. One of the things we've learned with vertical buffer zones, though, is you need to try to avoid creating what's known as a ramp. If you grow short things in your buffer closest to the field where the pesticide application might be, and they get progressively taller, if you've got enough wind, it'll essentially take all of the pesticides and ramp them right over the top and drop them down further in on your farm. So it's almost better to have some taller things closer to the edge and some grasses and other things a little bit further from the edge to help catch what filters through the taller batch. just something to keep in mind. Other things that we've done is we've moved more of our production to the center of the farm rather than the edges. We have moved certain crops out of the outdoor fields and into the high tunnels. What we've noticed since dicamba had been approved for over the top in soybeans, we haven't had very good field pepper production any year since 2017. We've always had issues with peppers and dicamba drift in our outdoor fields. So we started, well, I shouldn't say always. We had 2 years of that problem in a row. So I moved the peppers into the high tunnels because I noticed the same years that the peppers struggled with dicamba in the field, they did just fine when I had a few in the high tunnel. So I just moved the whole crop into a protected high tunnel area, and that seemed to solve that problem. The problem with that, of course, is that high tunnel space is prime real estate. And so you better hope that your peppers are doing really well to actually do a return, or you might decide to change your crops. And that's another way that you can use prevention techniques. You can move your crops to different locations, or you can decide certain crops that are really susceptible to problems, you're just not going to grow them anymore. Those are just some examples of things that we can do. Do folks have questions for me?
Thanks, Rob. That was a great, yep. Okay, so we've got, that was a great presentation, really informative. And I do have some questions. Jorgen asked, you mentioned calling, consulting your insurance agent. Was this more about liability, or did you have crop insurance coverage that was in play? Do you think there's situations where something like the whole farm revenue protection would compensate in the event of a drift incident that resulted in a crop loss?
Jorgen, I'm glad you asked that. Consulting an insurance agent is more about liability in the case of many food producers, but not all. We have not carried up until even recently a crop insurance, partly because crop insurance for our kind of farm has not been available. Or if it has been available, it requires too much effort and too much cost for the value it provides. So this is a problem for a lot of food producers, especially small diversified farms. There isn't a really good insurance option for us out there, which means we're kind of stuck trying to deal with an insurance adjuster for liability. And that insurance adjuster is going to be somebody working for the farm that had the pesticide application. So they're not necessarily working for us either. So they're not particularly pleased to be working with us. Now, Jorgen mentions the whole farm revenue protection. We have explored the whole farm revenue protection, and unfortunately, until this last year, it was not built for small diversified food production. And in the last year, they have changed the program somewhat where they think it might work for whole farm revenue protection for a small farm like ours. However, I'm not sure about that, because we've gone through several years where we've looked for the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Act and haven't been able to make it work for us. Part of the problem with that is you need to find an insurance agent that's willing to walk you through the process of getting whole farm revenue protection. And there are very few insurance agents in the state of Iowa that are even aware of the program or are willing to write up a policy for a farm like ours for crop insurance. And that often stops us from actually pursuing that. Which is, I'd like to see that change. But generally, if you're growing alternative crops, it's fairly difficult to get crop insurance. And yes, the other thing is we do still have the bulk price versus direct to consumer prices. Typically, if you're using the whole farm program, they typically immediately go right to the bulk prices. They'll probably go with the Chicago prices, which are often anywhere from 10% to 25%, or maybe lower than 10% given certain crops of what you would typically make if you were actually selling the product successfully. So unfortunately, it's just not a good answer.
Rob, I'm wondering about, I mean, the burden of kind of proving your case and demonstrating that an event happened and how you should be compensated for it. Are there, I imagine it's helpful to have somebody you can talk to that's gone through this before, or like, are there any groups or like resources for just like somebody that's going through this that might want to chat with somebody else that's gone through it before for encouragement or support?
To my knowledge, there isn't like a support group, if you know what I'm saying. It's not like
Yeah.
I've been sprayed on anonymous type things. We got most of our support, to be perfectly honest, from the other hort growers at PFI that we knew. So thankfully we had that. And I suspect if you talk with most of the hort growers, most of us will have some story that has something to do with the drift application problem. So in some ways, just simply being involved in a group of growers, and I realize I'm talking from the perspective of a horticultural grower on a small farm. We're not the only ones who have to struggle with this. If you're a viticulturist, or if you're an orchardist, or any number of alternative crops, you just need to be talking with people who do some of the things like you do it. And I think you'll find your support group is readily made. But unfortunately, I don't know of any place in particular where you can go and get the support we would have liked to have had when we go through this process. I think you often feel pretty isolated when an event like this occurs, and that's difficult. That's why I find giving presentations like this difficult, because I still get my blood pressure still goes up when I talk about these events, because they are difficult things to live through.
Absolutely. Well, and that's why we appreciate your insights so much. And before we opened the webinar for everyone, Rob was explaining how there's just so many resources everywhere and it's hard to navigate. So thank you so much for putting these together in this Farminar presentation for us. Let me see. We've talked a lot about, experience and knowledge. There's a lot of drift that happens through air. What about soil or water? Because there's, different seed coatings with fungicides or like neonicotinoid pesticides, and they could be water soluble. So is there any work or understanding around what other avenues for drift there are?
Yes, there's lots of work on all of those things. You probably want to be, I mean, if it's water, the water quality experts are doing a lot on any kind of drift that has to do with runoff. Again, runoff is a completely different thing. I mean, if you were talking about drift, everybody thinks about the air drift. And so if you went to the Pesticide Bureau and you want to report drift, I'm not sure how they would respond if you said that I had runoff from a farm uphill from me that had pesticides in it. I think you still report it, but I'm not sure how they would respond to it. But there are numerous people who do a lot with water quality. And don't forget either atmospheric loading. I talked about temperature inversions that can cause pesticide to go sideways. But if you don't have a warm weather or warm air cap, then some of this will just continue to go into the atmosphere. And folks my age still remember the stories of acid rain. Well, you can load the atmosphere with pesticides and that can come down in the rain somewhere further along the line. I don't know that there's much research on that either. So we have lots of ways pesticides can move, and can be a problem. And as Galen pointed, proving loss in general can be hard to prove. Can you imagine if you can't determine where this product comes from, how do you get compensation? If it's dicamba drift and it doesn't show any evidence for 1 to 3 weeks, and it could have drifted 3 days afterwards, who do I go to for compensation for that?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is there is nobody I can prove caused a problem. And in fact, the farmer may very well have applied according to use label. So that means they're not liable either. So I can lose product, I can lose yield with my sensitive crops, and there is no way I can get compensation for it. So it's a difficult problem. We need to do some things to change that.
Do you get the sense that there's more of an awareness and understanding about how sensitive, like application can be for other producer? Like, I guess, is there a change in awareness over time that you get a sense for on this issue?
A change of awareness for who? Applicators or?
Yeah, in general, just kind of understanding that there is this sensitive dynamic and that, like, there are consequences for spraying near other crops or, products that aren't intended to be sprayed on.
That's a hard question to answer. I'd like to say yes, but I'm not sure that I can.
Yeah.
I think that dicamba has made it easier to talk about it with other row croppers, because we have row croppers who would like to grow something other than a dicamba ready bean. And they're now planting defensively because they know that dicamba will move and possibly take that crop away from them. So in some ways that gives me a frame of reference to discuss with somebody else, but I'm not sure it helps beyond that. I hate to sound pessimistic, but I think that's probably the case.
There's room for progress.
There is always room for progress. I see that Jorgen's got a question about waiting for the outcome of the IDOL's investigation before pursuing legal remedies. Let me first answer the question how long it takes for IDOLs, typically the investigation process, to take. In our case, we've been through a few of them now. The final results typically take between, depending on their backlog, 8 to 14 months. So you will not necessarily know the final results of what they concluded for a period of time. So in answer to the question, no, you don't have to wait until IDOLS comes back, especially if you get your own test results, to pursue remedies, whether it's through insurance company or otherwise. But if you don't have the ability to get a test, you can't afford that, or you just don't manage to do so, you're often still waiting then for the IDOLS test. So yeah, it can be pretty delayed. It can take a long time. And that would be something I'd like to see change, because it's pretty hard for a small farm or a specialty crop grower to take that hit and hold on to it for a year or 2 years or 2.5 years before they get the compensation to put it back to where they should have been. If your business isn't already strong, you're probably out. You probably have to close shop. So apparently our business was pretty strong because we were still there in 2.5 years, and I'm still doing stuff now. So we did okay, but you shouldn't have to be that personally resilient to survive a drift incident. That's just my opinion, though. And I noticed that Galen Johnson's mentioning that European nations have outlawed many chemicals that we use heavily in this country. And Galen is correct. There are a number of chemicals that are either banned or restricted in other countries that are not restricted in the United States. In fact, if you were to go to the pesticide info database that I linked earlier, there's actually maps for all the chemicals to show you which countries have restricted use or banned use versus not. So it's kind of an interesting thing. If you like maps, you can go look at those things and see some of the differences, but there are a number of them.
Well, we are at time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the last Farminar of the season. Rob, thanks for rounding us out on the Farminar season this year, and thanks for organizing this very thoughtful and informative presentation for the Farminar. We really appreciate your insights and sharing your experience and perspective. Thank you, everyone. I will send all those links that were sprinkled through the slides in an email tomorrow morning, so you will have them for reference later on. Have a good night, everyone, and take care.